I'm super excited for us to engage in a rich conversation with the three of my dear friends in this space, Rick and Brendan and Layman. So, as you guys know, obviously some of the most well, you may not know this, but some of you know because you lived it with me. Some of my most transformative experiences in this space have been when I've traveled north into the beautiful Sky Meadow and hung with my dear friends across the various years and collaborated with Layman on leading. He plays Batman, I play Robin in relationship to the structure of metamodern spirituality and guides us, and I support in whatever limited way that I can as Brendan hosts us and Rick shows up and teaches us to meditate properly across a wide variety of different formats. So here now we get to kind of come together. We'll be revisiting that. Well, I don't know if you're going to be there, Rick, but in a not too next May, or not next May, in what, the 16th? We're not too far away from that. We're going to have another get together, of which I'm really excited about. So today we're going to be talking about extending extended naturalism. Fucking scientists. Come on, let's get with the real life of living. And can't you see over the horizon of your skepticism so that we can open up ourselves to really getting in contact with what's real? We'll find out about that. I don't know if you guys have an order, but basically we've got a lot to discuss, and then we'll, each of you are going to make a presentation, and then we'll have opportunities for dialogue, questions, and whatnot. Do we have? I'm not sure if we didn't get a chance to sort out exactly what order.
Yeah, I don't think we have an order. Is anybody who wants to go first? Are you excited to jump in, Rick?
I could go first if neither of you are feeling it. Okay, good. Look, I'm so glad that I actually typed up my presentation because I was worried that after hearing people like Alexander Bard, I'd be a little intellectually disoriented, and I am. But not just Alex, also Greg. You talk so fast with 9 million details about UTOK that I'm also, and I just read those 10 essays, 11 counting the appendix. My head is still spinning, but I love all this stuff. I am not a critic, except for one little thing, and you'll see in a moment. I'm just going to read my paper to you guys because there's a lot in here. And I titled my little talk, "Why I Want to Further Extend Extended Naturalism."
All right.
So in Greg and John's Appendix A, which in essence is kind of like the 11th essay, I read all of them again just the other day. They summarize from the Galileo Commission report 4 basic scientific worldviews. View A is fully reductionistic. Only the base level of physics is real. Psychology reduces to neurology, which reduces to biology, to chemistry, to physics. View B allows for sciences to deal with levels of complexity on non-fundamental levels, such as biology, etc., but remains metaphysically reductionistic. Only physics is real. View C, which is Greg's and John's, sees the complexified levels as involving genuinely emergent novel entities and novel causal powers that are not reducible to lower levels, so they're real. View D, which is the one that I'm closer to, allows for the validity of paranormal phenomena, which in my view challenge all 3 other views, A, B, and C, that Greg and John characterize as endo-naturalist, that's his view, and call view D exo-naturalist. He didn't mention exo, but he mentioned endo earlier, as if paranormal phenomena are external to nature or excluded from the natural world studied by science, and as if everything accounted for that is real is in views A, B, and C. Those things occur in the natural world studied by science. Not this other stuff. That's exo somehow or another to this world.
Exo-natural!
They say in their concluding sentence of the appendix, the problem they seek to solve, quote, is a problem to be solved within naturalism, and extended naturalism seeks to address this problem without making foundationalist claims one way or the other about exo-naturalistic assertions and perspectives, end of quote. But the endo-exo distinction strikes me as a kind of stealth version of the natural-supernatural distinction, which they say in an earlier essay is a false dichotomy. View C, that's Greg and John's, does improve significantly on views A and B. I love everything about it except what I think is this one little detail. In the same way that in an earlier essay, however, in the same way that they say in an earlier essay that they insist that if reductionism is to be allowed, it has to go all the way down, a parity of reasoning in the other direction suggests that if emergentism is to be allowed, it must go all the way up. So just to consider one possibly out there opposing view, if Bobby Azarian is right, and the universe is teleologically and anti-entropically evolving toward a state of cosmic omniscience, perhaps that's the fundamental level of reality attractor that explains everything else, which even attracted the Big Bang toward itself. Would that view be an exo-naturalist view? I don't think so. Thus, what work is the endo-exo distinction really doing, if not simply tacitly excluding a certain bunch of opposing views? Like the endo-exo distinction, I think the naturalism-supernaturalism distinction is a false dichotomy. They say that earlier also, because I think a good amount of paranormal phenomena are real and are part of nature, where nature includes whatever exists in reality, a view most human beings probably held for over 99% of human history. Okay, the term psychonaut has been used to refer to people who explore inner space, altered states of consciousness, using various techniques such as meditation, psychedelics, etc. Whether altered states reveal a reality outside the mind is considered an open question to some, although lately the perennial philosophical question whether anything exists outside the mind has seen a revival among scientists, philosophers, and other intellectuals. Technically, as Bernardo Kastrup and others have argued fairly plausibly, Occam's razor and radical empiricism together favor the mind-only view. Mind is immediately present in all knowledge. Matter is only inferentially entertained. Any psychonautic practices or experiences that expose one to aspects of reality that are not merely in the head, but which do not fit within standard naturalist ontology, I'm going to call ontonautic, like psychonaut, ontonaut. I've had countless ontonautic experiences. I'm an ontonaut. I don't expect others to believe such claims unless they've had ontonautic experiences, but I can't deny them as they've inoculated me against views A, B, and C as being comprehensive or complete. I'll sketch only two of my ontonautic inoculations. One, at age 15, I had an out-of-body experience in yoga meditation and instantly knew physicalism was false. That experience inspired me to become a yogic meditation adept, which opened me up to a world of ontonautic phenomena. Number two was of a complex series of about 100 sequential precognitive hits that I experienced in one dream. A hit is a highly improbable correct prediction. In the dream, this came up with Alex, Barb, what are dreams? In the dream, I got into a blue Volkswagen with Barry, one of my best friends, outside his house in Brooklyn with two guys I recognized from the Hilda Charlton meditation group we attended, but I didn't know personally, those other two. We drove down a very specific route involving several turns and miles into a neighborhood I'd never been in, along various streets, intersections, passing landmarks I've never seen, up Flatlands Avenue to Ralph Avenue, past an International House of Pancakes I'd never seen, up to Avenue L, then to the corner of East 72nd Street, where we stopped, got out of the car, and I stared at the intersection sign in an intense state of deja vu. We walked a few doors down to a certain stoop, up the stairs to a certain wooden carved door, went inside, down a black wrought iron staircase into the basement, into a dark candlelit meditation room where about 20 yogis sat cross-legged on the floor, several of whom I recognized from Hilda's meditation group, several I didn't know. Another meditation teacher named Joya, who came as a guest teacher once to Hilda's meditation group months earlier, sat in a lotus pose facing all the rest of us on a raised platform in front of an altar containing pictures of various yogis, saints, Hindu gods, Buddhas, statues, flowers, and incense. Joya led a mostly silent meditation that was incredibly powerful. When it was over, everyone got up, friends were hugging goodbyes, and a blonde, green-eyed woman I recognized from the Hilda group but didn't know personally came to me and asked how I liked it. I said it was great. After I told Barry about it, he admitted that he had been attending these private invitation-only meditations, but was sworn to secrecy. When Joya heard about the dream, she invited me. Every detail in so-called real life was a precognitive hit in the exact sequence of the dream, except the last one. That same blonde woman approached me in real life and said, "I dreamed you were here." I said, "So did I." Okay, that's my two ontognotic inoculation experiences. When that dream was confirmed, I knew that time was not unidirectional or whatever it is that we think it normally is, and began to puzzle about free will. Recently, I did the probability calculations with help from an AI. Here's a summary. 1, each hit in a precognitive dream has a conservative probability of about 1 in a million. 2, the probability of about 100 sequential hits is about -1 times 10 to the 60th power, which means 59 zeros before, getting to a non-zero number, which is about the odds of randomly selecting one specific atom from the visible universe. 3, the woman dreaming about me exponentially multiplies the improbability. Okay, nothing in nature happens with those probabilities. I've had countless such experiences, many of them with others having the same dream, which only multiplies the improbability even further exponentially, like multiple lightning strikes in different storms once a day, or multiple lottery hits, for a month or something like that. Additionally, many scientific studies undeniably confirm the existence of psychic phenomena. I'll mention just 2. 1, presentiment instead of precognition is about feeling in advance. Test subjects are intermittently subjected to genuinely randomized images with 3 valences: erotic, frightening, or neutral. Their bodies respond accordingly before the images arrive. Erotic excitation precedes erotic images. Stress responses precede frightening images, and neutral responses precede neutral ones. Number 2, psychokinesis, mind over matter or mind influencing matter. Test subjects are exposed to transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which temporarily disables brain activity in the regions exposed to it. Those regions are suspected of functioning as inhibitors of psychic activity on the hypothesis that the brain significantly functions to filter out otherwise overwhelming, irrelevant information that John would say is combinatorially explosive, including psychic information. Subjects are shown an arrow on a screen facing left or right and instructed to try to make it move in the direction it's pointing. The system randomly generates numbers that move the arrow a little bit one way or the other. The control group is not exposed to the TMS, and its scores are unexceptional. But the subjects exposed to TMS show a statistically significant increase in the extent to which the arrows move in the intended direction. Well, these are just 2 experiments. While the impact is small for most such experiments, the results are statistically significant and typically more statistically significant than the thresholds required in most scientific research. Dean Radin is the person to look into if you want to find out about that. If naturalism excludes supernatural things like these, to use a buzzword, that's probably an unhappy word in the realm of naturalists, then I'm not a naturalist. I believe that view C is definitely much better than views A and B, but it's incomplete the way Newtonian physics is incomplete. Maybe not that incomplete, but still, I think it's a big difference. If psychic phenomena involve let's consider some possibilities. If psychic phenomena involve interactions between adjacent physical worlds in the physical multiverse, which is a theory that many smart theoretical physicists think is totally legitimate, then those phenomena would be metaphysically legitimate even under views A, B, and C. Would they be exo? I don't think so. Unless by endo we want to refer only to the one physical world among many in a physical multiverse. On the block universe view, which was discussed in the previous talk, which is kind of weird, every moment exists timelessly, like frames frozen in time in a cosmic DVD, like when you pause the DVD, it's non-moving. The only thing that moves is a thread of consciousness. But this view challenges belief not only in free will or agency, but causation most generally. Every single item is independent of every other one. Again, if that was the case, is it an exo view? I don't think so. Bernardo Kastrup's and Donald Hoffman's models both have consciousness as fundamental, fairly consistent with panpsychism and non-dualistic philosophies like Vedanta and a whole bunch of other ones. If any of these views correctly describe our reality, are they exo views? I don't think so. If consciousness is more fundamental than space-time, as Hoffman thinks, then psychic phenomena might be closer to the substructure of reality, consciousness, than the superstructure of space-time and everything that occurs within it. Likewise, if everything that exists has some kind of rudimentary mindedness or consciousness, that's another thing that was debated in the last talk, consciousness versus mind. If quantum entanglement, now here's the thing, if quantum entanglement or non-locality is real, such that two particles once attached behave as if they're still locally attached, even though they're thousands of miles apart, or non-local, and science says this is the case, excuse me, and if space-time is inseparable into separate components of time and space, and science says that that is the case, then there must also exist quantum temporal entanglement or temporal non-locality, which makes time travel possible within even a single world physicalistic framework of views A, B, and C. If consciousness extends through temporally non-local elements of itself, such that a future state of my consciousness is quantum entangled with the present state, then precognition is not only possible on naturalism, but highly likely, given my non-local, non-logical identity with my consciousness across time. Would that be exo? I don't think so. Okay, meanings of terms. Every noun, like naturalism, has inclusion and exclusion criteria, or sameness and difference. For example, the word cat excludes everything that's a non-cat. So if nothing is a non-cat, then everything's a cat, but then we can't distinguish between cats and non-cats, and the word becomes meaningless. So endonaturalism must exclude whatever is not matter, energy, abstract features of or causal relationships between matter and energy. But does the paranormal really fall into this category? Things like telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition are neither matter nor any kind of known energy, but they involve causal powers. So they could be, and I think should be, part of a more extended naturalism. I believe that many paranormal things are real, that there's no reason to think they're not part of the same reality that view C seeks to explain, thus part of the natural world, as most human beings believed until recently. I'm inspired personally to not speak in a way that supports a view that denies my paranormal experiences. Analogous to individuals who identify as gender non-binary or gender fluid because they either reject sexual or gender dimorphism or prefer to optionally identify as either or neither at different times, when it comes to endo-exo-naturalism and supernaturalism, I would say I'm ontologically non-binary or fluid, since I reject these binaries and prefer to view the world as possibly either or neither, depending on the latest science and my latest understanding, which fluctuates with my experiences and my increasing reflections on them. But because I know my paranormal experiences are real, I am Gnostic in that sense. But because I don't fully understand the physics or metaphysics that makes them possible, I'm agnostic about the metaphysics, which inclines me to also reject the Gnostic-agnostic binary, rendering me both onto and epistemically fluid. All of these frameworks that we've entertained today so far seem to capture various similar and different aspects of reality, like so many blind men and the elephant in the Jane metaphor. Greg's and John's framework captures a lot more of the elephant than most predecessor views, but I think the essential nature of the elephant is still radically different. To play with the metaphor, it may be elephants all the way down and all the way up. I can only speak as one such blind man holding the paranormal aspect of the elephant, but unlike many, if not most of the other blind men, I don't suggest that the aspect I'm holding exhausts the nature of the beast or that the other blind folks are incorrect. I can conceive of an interpretation of energy that could include, for example, what we now conceive of as whatever must be involved in psychic phenomena, if it can be measured in some way, and it seems like it can. If it enables quantum effects, it might. If it somehow warps time or space, and so on the generally accepted scientific principle that something only exists if it can affect or be affected by anything else. This causal ontological principle, which John discussed earlier, is shared by most forms of philosophy and science throughout human history And I think it should be applied to paranormal phenomena. I think there's a real there. Okay, almost done. David Hume rejected the concept of literal miracles in the biblical sense because by definition, they must violate physical laws or else it won't be a real miracle. But laws, by definition, are inviolable, in which case the miracle concept is by definition a violation of the inviolable and thus self-refuting. But if something does violate what was wrongly believed to be inviolable, then it was not inviolable and it wasn't a law. Similarly, déjà vu may be described as self-refuting if you take it to mean, by definition, remembering something that you've never experienced. But if we can pre-member the future, thanks to quantum temporal entanglement with our own future mental states, then what we thought was inviolably lawful, namely the unidirectional flow of temporal consciousness, was not inviolable. If naturalism is further extended to include these kinds of things, then I'm a friend of naturalism, but not necessarily exonaturalism. But even so, I remain an onto and gnosis, non-binary, fluid, partly blind man. That's my presentation. Thank you.
That's glorious. Thank you, Rick. Obviously, we're going to go in order, and then we'll dialogue. Is that or would we I don't. If you guys have a preference, either way. Lots to.
Let's maybe have all of us do our presentations, and then have
that
some
seems to make
questions
the most
and
sense.
dialogue.
Yeah, and like
so
in the previous one, the three of us or the four of us with you, Greg, will have a little bit of interchange, and then the Q&A.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay.
Okay. I can't tell if I'm going to sound crazier or less crazy than Rick. We'll see how this goes. The relevant information processing regimes of current natural science history that go something like matter, life, mind, culture, and X, where X is partly unknown, is partly associated with certain ancient transcendental capacities that human persons demonstrate and which might occasionally border on the paranormal. It's partly associated with our anticipation of radical forms of technosocial novelty. And it's partly associated with the intentional extension of developmental trends that show up in things like complex neo-Piagetian studies of human maturation. So in the couple of minutes that I have here for opening statements, I'm going to walk through recent parts of our evolutionary stack and end up at this X point with some general thoughts about how a spirituality moves forward from or might extend the model of extended naturalism that Greg and John are inviting us to think with them about. So let's start with life. Cells have a certain responsiveness, electrochemical sensitivity, goal-oriented self-regulatory behavior in a field of relations, makes it fairly easy for us to sympathize with them. We tend to assume their interiority in some fashion. But at the same time, we're not that impressed. If cells were to get it together and form collectives like plants, we might consider eating them. But it's really only when a bunch of them are internetworked by a nervous system and folded into a skin sac and braced by spines and bones and become capable of extended territorial mobility that we actually start paying attention to them. And when we pay attention to them, two things are obvious to us about these neuromobile gardens or animals. First, we see that they have an increased range of informational capacity. Their external complexity of interaction with environments and their internal complexity of self-tweaking are massively amplified. And the streams of responsive sensitivity that we observe in things like cells are coordinated and synergized and hybridized in really interesting ways. That's the first thing that stands out. The second thing is that we notice that a lot of these animals, at least for several hours a day, get up and act like fairly deliberate agents in the world. They have installed a neurobehavioral operating system that Greg might call a mindedness. But we can't ask them about it, and it doesn't look like they can ask each other about it. So we call it unconscious, and we're free to eat them. They are delicious. But then there's a few of them that upgrade to what I would call a body image operating system. It makes a half-assed map of the individual animal so that it can recognize itself in a mirror and pull off some pretty interesting basic tool usage, including a small number of abstract tools that are speech-like, as long as those abstractions don't start referring back to themselves too complexly. So these animals, like chimps and elephants and dolphins, we don't eat them unless we really have to. And it's pretty clear to us that they are intelligent, fully immersed, basically thoughtless experiencers of self and world, and that hits pretty close to home for us. We seem to flex in and out of that state ourselves. Sometimes we think about it as a tragic regression, like we're so overloaded or ill or injured that we can't identify things in the world around us anymore, and we're just functioning in a brute straightforwardness without burning all that extra glucose. Other times we actively aspire to return to that state, to get out of our mind and come back to our senses, man. But we have all these kinds of weird aspirational notions because we've already upgraded to the semantic operating system. That means that most humans, for several hours a day, can operate as intercommunicative, self-referential persons, and we try not to eat them at all, even in emergencies. Persons are abstract self-referential agents whose perceptual field is redoubled into knowledge by something like mutually cultivated, always guessing and adjusting socio-symbolic meaning tags that chunk the world into identities that both exceed and epitomize perceptions. There's a utilitarian kind of targeted left brain mode and a more fluid gestalty right brain mode of that, with a couple of social and gender and neurodiversity caveats. But this third kind of mindedness operates as if on a great playing board, where we're driven by some sense of existential lack or mismatch towards symbolically mediated partial versions of our underlying biological drives that are reflected back to us through internalized images of terrible, desirable, or all-knowing others. And on this constantly shifting quest, we move from one duality context to the next. We move through yeses and nos, is or isn't, agrees or disagrees. And I might tell you I disagree when I actually kind of agree. So you can't analyze this semantic operating system unless you take into account that it has both psycholinguistic mindedness and a kind of virtual or performative interpersonal linguistic mindedness that's semi-autonomous. In fact, I could be lying to you right now. So, okay, here we are. We're atop the extended naturalism stack. And if I were a spiritual teacher, how would I extend or overextend the stacked journey of consciousnesses and mindednesses? Point, what questions might there be if our goal was not the therapeutic regulation of a three-minded being in a more or less pathological civilization, but if we were interested in the cultivation of another kind of mind, let's call it mind 4 to keep it simple, that might be appropriate to a realigned civilization with new technological capacities. In theory, I could zero in on the role of integrations and entanglements and synergies in upgrading subjective capacity at each of these developmental evolutionary steps. I could also come on hard and radical like a Zen koan trainer and suggest that the main thing we need to do is to non-dually max out the basic dualities that form the sense-making membrane of mind 3 to access trans-justificatory epiphany states. That's important, but it might not be general enough. In practice, I think the thing we need to do is first begin with isolating mind 3A. So if we were going at this, I would encourage people who self-select for extended mind training to be more relaxed, more forthcoming, less constrained, at least among each other, by the ordinary social implications of good and bad. I would ask them to get better at quickly using mind 3A to locate itself, both as the epicenter and the extended field of consciously known symbolic entities. And I might even suggest that people learn to play a role socially or go undercover, join a club or religion you don't necessarily agree with, do some counter-social role playing so that you get better at teasing apart your 3A from your 3B. All of that, I think, is a really good place to start. And as we get better at self-clarifying mind 3A. We also want to get a sense of its contours and functional limits relative to other minds in the stack. Because 3A does the talking, when we're talking about ourselves, we tend to conflate 3A with the total self. And we ascribe to it various dignified and aspirational qualities that seem to make the human person into the crown of creation. We refer to 3A as self-aware and intentional and rational and goal-oriented, a real self in a sea of meaning. Maybe it even has a soul. It certainly seems to have narrative memory and opinions about things. But if you undertake exercises to try to remember the existence of your symbolic self-awareness while you're doing daily activities, if you give yourself a simple task like don't use the word I today or keep your highest values in mind, you quickly discover the fact that we have an extremely limited ability to actually perform the functions we attribute to mind 3A. Most of our assumptions about our psychological attributes might in fact be internalizations of 3B social propaganda about modern human selfhood. So we need to begin to learn the boundaries, the functional boundaries of 3A by experimentation. This could be an important early step in developmentally oriented extended naturalism. And there's multiple utilities to these kinds of exercises. Right? I think running up against 3A's frequent inability to do what it thinks it can increases your humility. Intentional, abnormal exercises increases your willpower and actually makes you a little bit more like what 3A claims for itself. But thirdly, and maybe most importantly, there's this dawning visceral experiential awareness that many of the qualities we attribute to 3A might actually belong to one of the other intelligence systems. And it might be one of the earlier systems. So we discover some seemingly reasonable opinion of ours was actually a stupid mammalian territory demonstration thinly disguised behind some symbols. But alternatively, perhaps some of these aspirational qualities belong to another system that isn't already well described in the stack or may not fully have emerged. For example, we seem to have moments of overflowing, suffusing of self-presence and clarity of purpose, which can be a temporary point of access to or co-production with some fourth kind of mind. Oops. Hold on. Getting a flashing computer warning here. Okay, there we go. These other possible emergent systems. A lot of these experiences, and Rick pointed to some of them, they may be accessing or may be involved in co-producing an additional capacity of mind that has a lot of the characteristics that we aspirationally hope that 3A actually has, but which when we examine the normal status of 3A, they don't seem to be there in any consistent way. So in developmental communities, we might be teaching 3A to map itself better, and in the process to map its relations to others of our minds, both personally and interpersonally. 3A can get better at discerning and inhabiting other minds. So we might start to practice sensing the body from the inside, returning to the senses, gaining facility in whole bodily interoceptive and proprioceptive awareness, generating the bracketing of the flow of symbolic thoughts so that we can attend to the coherence and richness of the perceptual field. But as per extended naturalism, we are not in doing that hippies who think mind too is our real consciousness, because we are practicing something that our animal cousins do not, we think, do, which is being thoughtless on purpose. We're working in these processes with the muscle of deliberate modification of attention. That is to say, in our attempts to be and re-inhabit the subconscious self or the body or pure sensory experience, or even to drop completely into the weird samadhi of the unconscious organism, we're constantly working on some kind of intentional metacognitive operation where 3A is learning to incept different relationships between the different minds and the different aspects of the minds. As this kind of facility increases, it becomes plausible to work on the deliberate production of an adjusted alignment between these minds. right? So in a very practical sense, maybe you undertake yoga or some other behavioral routine where you practice coordinating body and desire and emotion and sensation and knowledge, observing and assimilating any extra or unusual conditions that periodically emerge from sustained efforts to produce more active collaboration between this plurality of minds. One very interesting option is to rethink what mindfulness means in terms of multi-self-awareness of the kind that's being discussed in extended naturalism. So plural mindfulness, right? Perhaps you breathe in and you say I to yourself, remembering the locus and the extension of the field of semantic identities. And you breathe out saying am, while sensing the neuromuscular organism and recalling that most of your intelligence is operating unconsciously right now. That kind of I and that kind of am, and performing a practice like that periodically until an experience of blending between those different functions seems to emerge. That's one example of 3A, practicing to set itself into a position at the center of the mandala where it might be able to modify, align, and merge with other functional systems. In that process, something is growing. It's intentional metacognitive intra-being. I'm also going to call it HGI, human general intelligence. I call it that because I think it's not only an existential curiosity, a kind of weird aesthetic gymnastics that might appeal to the inner dilettantes among us, but I think it's also perhaps a necessity for the transdisciplinary AI civilization that's emerging now in tandem with extended naturalism. AGI requires HGI in order for us to have a role in the new kind of intelligence ecosystem that's emerging. I would say that human general intelligence replicates and extends the kinds of balances and struggles and synergies that have done the work producing the different consciousnesses and mindednesses through evolutionary history, but it does that on top of the existing three-mind structure. It takes the relational intersplicing of information styles, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, treats that as the underlying driver or an underlying driver of the history of these emergences, and extends what's already been working in those level emergence moves. I think that with enough practice, and also perhaps with additional attempts to shift into the experiences and sensibilities that are generated by those practices, as if the new emergent sensibility is the basic agent of our life, we may have opportunities to begin to establish that not just as experience, but as a new operating system, as a mindedness and not just a consciousness. And I think we need to do this in a way and in a frame that I would describe roughly as complex, non-reductive, transcendental agnosticism, meaning that to track this forward, especially in practice, to cultivate the next mindfulness and the next mindedness, we need notions of mind and consciousness that are plural enough to reveal the differentiated landscape of what normally gets covered over by a packed suitcase word like consciousness, but also is coherent and structured enough to be useful for real analysis. And I think one of the primary issues here from a spiritual point of view is to address the experience and intuition of some seemingly universal and primordial versions of consciousness without necessarily conflating that with any particular version of animal mindedness or person mindedness. And yet to do all of that without, again, preemptively asserting that this or that quality, which seems to be specific to personhood, can't for any reason be present in a more extended field of consciousness. And that's a very delicate balance, but I see that balance in what John and Greg are working on. I think all of this is open for exploration, and it requires a better map to do better philosophy and better science with this stuff. I'm a person who's had numerous experiences of something that looks like an omnipresent field of coherent awareness with some person-like qualities and possibly a transcendental mindedness at all scales and at all emergent information regimes. I've had numerous ontognotic inoculations in Rick's sense. And these spiritual philosophies that normally cover this kind of stuff, I view as essentially training philosophies. These philosophies have been too quick to assert that these kinds of experiences are explanatory facts in a dogmatic metaphysics. Whether or not these are facts, or which forms of them might or might not meet our threshold for defining them as facts, The essential thing to begin this work is that our new models of reality must ground themselves in a non-reductive naturalism and be open to the full radical phenomenology of such transcendental experiences that I would call the supranormative meaning-making possibilities for human beings. To make this kind of delicately balanced move requires that we do not solely assume that the only valid data for modeling reality is physical environment information with no useful addition provided by experiencers, but nor can we assume that reality is constructed simply and straightforwardly such that a pre-existing proto-subjectivity or supersubjectivity are the necessary interpretation of the mystic's greatest experiences. This kind of concern I see as an extension of what extended naturalism is calling the knowledge problem. And for all of these reasons, I really like the view of extended naturalism in this project. I think this is very much the kind of approach that is currently the most science adjacent and operationalizable version of the contemporary evolutionary transperspectival multi-epistemological meta-theories. Check-in complete.
All right. Thank you, friend. We shift over to Brendan. That was lovely.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. How do I follow on all of that? Let's see. Well, so I was actually kind of thinking I would take a slightly different tack here, though all of this does certainly weave together in many ways. My interest, the thing I'd like to explore briefly is kind of the extension into the temporal horizon before us, into what Greg in the UTOK system refers to as that. Is it the fifth joint point, Greg? The horizon before us as we face an emerging complexity layer. Of course, the tree of knowledge system gives us a wonderful kind of ontic map of matter, life, mind, and culture, and allows us to see these emerging levels of complexity across cosmic evolution, and recognizing as well that these are distinct information processing systems that allow these that give rise to these planes, I think is crucial for understanding where we're at now in our current moment as we face what seems to be the inchoate emergence of yet another layer onto that stack, which again has sort of been framed by Greg as sort of the digital identity problem and the fifth joint point. The question now of the emerging information processing system that is something of a kind of networked computer digital noosphere that is giving rise to whatever comes next in this process. And so there's a few aspects that I wanted to explore there, because I think that this question of what is before us is in some ways understandable in the frame of extended naturalism, in the sense that as new planes of complexity emerge upon older ones, there are new capacities, new competencies that in some ways seem almost magical to what would have been at a lower level of complexity. The fact that I'm able to do right now what I'm doing, vibrating the air, and we're all able to coordinate our activity, is the consequence of an information processing system not available to minded animals, to which we seem like operating at some other level, which we are. And similarly, with animals able to neuronally navigate their environments in a way that, say, plant life cannot. There are unique capacities that emerge at these levels that render what seemed natural or the norm from a prior level of complexity no longer the case, that there have been sort of a super position that's been sort of added onto that. And so with increasing complexity, we get sort of novel ways of considering what is possible in the natural world. There's a famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke who said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think that that's kind of the moment that we're facing right now with the rise of generative and other kinds of AI, and the sort of dawning moment in which human technological capacities seem in some ways a kind of magical addition to our capacities hitherto conceived. So I wanted to explore that topic in this framework, and also explore a particular way of thinking about it, because I think that there are ways we can, let's say, we can be better or worse at navigating what's before us. And particularly if we misframe the situation, we're destined to, I think, put ourselves in considerable danger, and with rather high stakes in the sense of existential risk. So understanding what it is that we are experiencing, where we're going, seems really crucial at this moment. And it is very much a crucible, a kind of crux point in human history, as we're just at the doorstep potentially of this new layer of reality in some ways. So how do we understand that, and what is our role in it, and how do we relate to it? These are all big questions. And specifically what I wanted to focus on, again, in the context of this conference, was how this is being framed relative to consciousness. So for example, yesterday, actually, there was an article in the New York Times called "If AI Systems Become Conscious, Should They Have Rights?" Now, this is an interesting and in some ways very important question, is it not? I think what I want to focus on here is the notion that there's just the prospect of this being a reality, that the New York Times is running, in a sense, front page articles about the prospect of our AI systems generating consciousness, and then how do we relate to these, and how do we treat them, and what's sort of the moral and ethical responsibilities that are before us in that kind of reality. Now, I guess in a sense, the question I'm posing is this at all framing the issue, our situation, correctly, or is there a fundamental confusion or misunderstanding of what is sort of lying before us? And these things, again, have incredible stakes, because if we misframe it, there are a number of options out there for how people are understanding this that are on offer. They kind of go under what's been called the TESCREAL set of ideologies and worldviews around our current particular moment. And the T, for example, transhumanism, which I'm going to, in some ways, as I talk about these things, somewhat caricature them or stereotype them for the sake of not getting into all the details. There are people operating in these worldviews, and there are complexities to them and nuances, and some of them are more or less sophisticated. So I'm not trying to suggest that what I'm kind of pigeonholing them as is their sum totality. But there is a notion in particular transhumanist ideologies that there's a prospect of human beings sort of giving rise to a technological AI that, through its vast, let's say, exponentially broader intelligence capacities and potential consciousness, basically just shuffles off its sort of biological, creators, in which scenario the human world and everything that we care and love is just sort of discarded as so much sort of dross as part of some other story. And what really matters now is the future of the technology. It's the future of the AI. And we were just sort of like these very primitive beings that just help get that going. And now we can all just sort of fade into oblivion. Again, something of a caricature, but not so much. I mean, there are aspects and ideologies that are really at the forefront of a lot of Silicon Valley thought, and people in incredible positions of power with a lot of wealth that think in these kinds of terms. And again, the question then is this a misframing of both what is possible, what's real, and how we should relate to those? And I'm going to suggest here that it is. And the reason why, I think, is because of the nature of consciousness. I think as we are coming to greater understanding of it, or at least as certain frameworks, particularly those offered by UTOK and the extended naturalistic framework that's being offered here, as they're articulating this, I think there's a lot of coherent, compelling ways of understanding what is and remains very much a mystery when we talk about consciousness, but still gives us a sort of picture in which we can understand these ideological narratives and either call bullshit or say, yes, that's clearly the path that we're on and the way that maybe we are going, if not should go. So how I want to kind of deconstruct this idea is by turning to this framework that we're using, and for understanding what consciousness in all these kind of variegated ways means and what it signifies. And this has a couple of also direct connections to other big questions in the kind of AI scene, which has to do with alignment. It has to do with this issue of can AIs become conscious, and it has to do with all that we're kind of stepping into now in this world that we can expect to be increasingly dominated by AI. So the question then is, can an AI system become conscious? And I want to propose why I do not think that it can, with reference to what we think we know based on this framework that we're using about the origins of consciousness and what that might tell us about this question. The last thing I want to say about this, just by way of exposition or setting things up, is I want to make the claim, as I did also in my previous, I think 2024 UTOK conference, about the notion that consciousness is fundamentally value laden and deeply ingrained in what we mean by meaning. So a lot of the question around AI alignment has to do with this question of how do we align our technological AIs with sort of human values and concerns and meanings. And already there's something, again, sort of indicative or telling in that question. The fact that we supposedly need to do this suggests that it's not there inherently, and I think that that tells us something. So I'll start there by getting at this notion of, in some also ways, extended naturalism further to include also issues of value and meaning as, in a sense, fundamental to what we're talking about in terms of consciousness. For those who might have read my book, A Universal Learning Process, this develops ideas that I've expanded upon more there. A lot of these ideas have also already been raised in what John was saying and in other aspects of what Greg has already been saying. And Greg also mentioned this excellent book, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. So I'll just briefly summarize this hypothesis, which is something like this. When we are looking at a mind to subjective conscious being, which is the kind of conscious that people are referring to when they ask a question like, if AI systems become conscious, should they have rights? Then what we have to see that as is an emergence out of a mind one kind of unconscious level beforehand, which, as we understand, emerged through a process of various sort of response reflexes in a dynamic that Ginsberg and Jablonka talk about as associative learning. Through certain evolutionary processes, you get the evolution of capacities for living organisms to basically have reflexes that help them maintain their viability. This also came up in one of the first questions that was asked in a previous session around, the will to live. Where does that come from, and what's that all about? Without fully unpacking all of that, I do want to say that that lies at the root of all of this, that living organisms certainly have in a sense, an evolutionarily ingrained desire for self-preservation, and that the self-organizational processes that give rise to autopoietic systems then have these self-referential let's say, drives to exist, drives to maintain. This is part of the struggle for existence in the basic kind of evolutionary dynamics that exist. That things that will maintain and preserve themselves and even strive to maximize or kind of enhance their flourishing, those things get carried on, and those things that don't or are not successful in that do not. And so therefore, there's a kind of natural carrying forward of things with that will to survive and with particular skills to do so. And that this accretes and that this iteratively builds on itself so that over time you get increasingly competent, in a sense, living organisms with a greater capacity at greater levels of complexity to maintain that complexity, reproduce it, extend it, and so on and so forth. And that in many ways is the story of the tree of knowledge, of moving from these different complexity planes, so that you get from sort of the survival of the stable, things that just are, eventually into fully biological organisms that have a teleological orientation towards their own self-maintenance and viability. Now, why I bring all this up is because this is the basis of meaning and value. If a bacterium using chemotaxis tracks to the left when it encounters a toxin, on its right, and vice versa when it encounters, say, sugar on its left, that's a kind of process that aids its viability. And building on those kinds of processes are what leads to increased complexification of biological organisms over time. That this is a good for and a bad for that particular organism. Toxin is bad for, and the sugar is good for. And that we can see that these have a particular, in a sense, normative quality for these entities in context. Now, when you kind of track that up through complexification from single-celled organisms all the way to, let's say, an animal on the mind plane, you've got now a whole bunch of set of new capacities and abilities to, say, navigate 3D space, take in information from your environment through the nervous system, but they're in pursuance of that same kind of deep logic of self-preservation and maintaining or enhancing viability. And so this is, again, at the core of sort of Greg's, UTOK's behavioral investment theory. It's the notion that we are motivated to pursue what increases or, preserves our viability as organisms, and that is sort of the logic driving our behavior. Now, this is all significant because what happens, arguably, in the story, for example, that gets told in this book and in the UTOK framework generally, is that mind to subjective consciousness emerges out of just simple, basic associative learning processes getting synced up and integrated into a capacity for a singular organism to, in a sense, have a shared value currency, right? So the notion of, well, do I go after this, prey over here, or do I seek this mate over here, or do I avoid this predator here? There's a number of conflicting potential valences, let's say, or rather goal states that are going to lead to particular sets of valences that get experienced through the nervous system. And when these get tracked up and synced up together and broadcast throughout the body of the organism as a whole, this is argued as sort of that root of this kind of mind to subjective phenomenological consciousness, the particular kind of consciousness that's rooted on all those mind one unconscious processings that get synced up, integrated information, and then this kind of subjective awareness. Now, the reason why all that's significant is because all that subjective conscious architecture is based on meaning and value. It's based on a syncing up of value currencies for an animal in a context. And what it is helping that animal to do is orient to things that it values, its goal states, and to avoid harm and to maintain its viability and enhance its flourishing. So what the argument that I'm making, or at least that I'm drawing out of all the arguments that have already been made, is that consciousness is fundamentally value laden. It's fundamentally meaningful in its orientation. It is synced up meaning and value in some phenomenological, what we experience then as phenomenological subjective consciousness. Now, I think that this is super important at so many levels. One of them is just that we often, I think, don't often think about that. We don't frame it as centrally as I think that we should, which is to consider that, especially in the context of a meaning crisis, what does it mean once you start realizing that your entire experience as just a human being presumes deep value and meaning to your whole way of being? And to try to actually take that seriously, tap into it, and attend to it, there's so much there that could be said. But the reason why I bring it up in this context is because I think it helps us get a good grip on this broader fifth joint point situation that we find ourselves in, and the questions of, can AI become conscious, and all the downstream consequences that would come from something like that. Now, the whole thing about this is that to be good for or bad for, to have values, to have meanings, requires that you've got skin in the game, okay? An animal can die. That's its existential situation. It can die, or it can do things in such a way that stop it from dying. And that is to maintain its complexity, its informational richness, to fight off thermodynamic entropy, all these kinds of ways you could put that. But fundamentally, the existential kind of drive of an organism is don't die, okay? Now, if you can die, then you have values, then you have meanings. So in a sense, the possibility that you cannot be is in a sense, prerequisite for the having of values and orientations and goals and normative states relative to other things. If everything was all just the same, then it doesn't matter, right? And then there is no distinction. There is no teleology driving you to be this rather than this. Now, the reason why this is profoundly significant relative to all this technology is the question of the alignment issue, right? Put simply, does a computer have this existential drive? Does an LLM, does a vast network of computers and a kind of processing data bank? Arguably, to have let's say for the preconditions of conscious emergence to be set, there needs to be an existential challenge that's posed to a singular entity in which consciousness arises to navigate those challenges and orient towards values and meanings. It's precisely because AI doesn't have that we have something like the alignment problem, which is, hey, we've got to actually impose value on these computational machines such that they act in a certain way. But if you notice, genuine values, you could say, and meanings emerge organically, spontaneously, and intrinsically out of the dynamics of just agents and arenas having goals relative to trying to maintain their viability. So to wrap all this up, the suggestion here is something like, we're misframing this, I think, if we're imagining that we're giving that the prospect is that human beings will give birth to an AI that will gain consciousness and then slough off its sort of mortal, human, lowly, primitive, biological, sort of creators. I think that that's entirely the wrong way of understanding it. And I think that we're also in danger of over-interpreting what it is that we've created just because the outputs mimic what conscious human activity looks like. So we might assign consciousness just on the basis of a kind of Turing test without understanding the deeper mechanics of consciousness as being fundamentally about existential responses to challenges that generate meanings and values. So absent that, I think we at least have to ask the question, do these emerging AIs have the capacity for any of that? Or do we need to actually set up the conditions in which they do? Would that actually be an improvement? But this raises its own ethical questions, right? If you put an AI in an embodied being that actually now has the fear of death, this is actually a whole other level of playing God. Whether or not it's even, sort of mechanically possible to situate things in that way. There is a famous art piece that I saw a while ago that I think came closest to getting at what we would need to kind of have, which is something like, if you've ever seen this piece, it's a kind of arm. It's a mechanical arm that is continually using its battery fluid to wipe up the leaking battery fluid that is powering it. Now, of course, entropy will eventually win out. It won't be able to, and it will turn off. But in some ways, this is a rather tragic view, and it's a rather sad image because you're watching this machine, in a sense, desperately trying to maintain its ongoing functioning nature. On the other hand, though, it's a profound artistic representation of what it means to be alive, to be a behaviorally invested organism, always trying to maintain yourself in an entropic universe. And absent some kind of structure like that, I don't believe that an AI or any other technology has the constraints to ever achieve or let's just say achieve a kind of conscious state. So the last thing I'll say about all of that is I think a rethinking of what all this suggests, which is I would posit that we are in a much better position to understand what this fifth joint point is about and where we're going if we interpret it as a full stack. The whole notion of transhumanists suggesting that we'll just, that AI rather will just kick aside its sort of biological substrate or like origin point and move off into the space or something misses entirely the way that complexity builds and accretes on existing complexity stacks. Like I am matter, life, mind, and culture. I am all those things. I can't just kick out my biological substrate and just say, oh, I'm just culture now, or I'm just a symbolic processing entity. Doesn't work that way. It's all predicated on all those factors leading to new emergent capacities built on fundamentally a thermodynamic imperative to avoid entropy and dissolution. And so I invite people to consider instead that what we're doing is supplementing the stack, which includes human beings in that culture stack, and that we are adding on a fifth layer, or an additional layer rather, onto that can enhance our existing embedded, embodied, biologically substrated consciousness with a whole new set of capacities based on the radical computational power of these AI systems. Very different vision, and it's one that I think properly centers the human in a significant way that avoids a lot of these dystopian narratives. But if people are confused about this, then I think then we're in a lot of trouble, especially in terms of the flow of energy and resources and what gets directed to what as we enter this sort of uncertain phase. Not to mention all of the kind of cultural and social initial confusion around how do we treat robots and this and that sort of thing. So I wanted to formally present that idea in some context, and this seemed like an interesting way or an interesting opportunity to do that. So a little bit different from the other things that have been brought out here, but hopefully people can see some of the connecting threads. And yeah, thanks for paying attention.
All right. That was lovely. I have lots to say, but I wasn't sure if you guys wanted to chat or ask each other questions first before I jump in, or I can
why
go
don't
now.
you go ahead with what you've got,
Okay.
and we'll respond if it's appropriate, and then we can kind of interrogate each other a little bit.
Lovely. Well, first off, I love you guys, so we'll start there. You know, that's a good thing. Love, and you know, everything that was said is right on target in terms of, for me at least, extending extended naturalism in a complexifying way that makes sense. So the first, let me go to Rick. Let's dialogue, Rick, in relation in terms of what I'm saying and what it may sound like I'm saying. Because I've been having some conversations, or at least on the Bard's listserv with Bobby, and it really helps me to get clear, and I know I need to know what I'm saying, and then if there's disagreement or whatnot, we can sort that out. So the exo is taken from Sean S. Borden Hargan's frame, who talked about exo studies, and he's talking about that in a very serious and respectful, believing light. So I will simply say that for one starting point, the referent is from somebody who's embracing that frame of reference. And the other thing I'll say is Scientific Worldview D in the appendix is Dean Radin's frame, or I mean, I cite him, and I would say he's sort of the leader of a particular set of arguments that says the empirical evidence is clear for psi phenomenon. We'll just put it all in that box for right now. For scientists to accept that as a reliable and valid phenomena in the world. So my first basic response is, well, it's okay. So scientific worldview D, if that's, and then whatever we call that, is, to me, this is what I said to Bobby, at least where I'm coming from. Okay, I'm agnostic. I've had my own weird experiences, maybe not quite as dramatic, and the more dramatic it would be, the more likely. But I've had enough to be like, huh, you know, what was the word? I wrote it down, ontonotic. And you know, and I know so many people with enormous amount of respect that I have, like yourself, Layman. And it just opens up all sorts of sort of what I would call empirical, meaning like experienced events that you see, feel, and raise deep questions about the fundamental nature of the universe that I'm agnostic about. So that's where I am. I'm metaphysically and ontologically agnostic. The term endo is positioned relative to exo in the way I'm talking about it, because I want to focus attention on the current consensual. And I don't mean that like with normative authority. I simply mean if we ask a bunch of scientists together and say, what is the basic shared understanding of the natural world? I want to focus on that. That's what I mean by endo. And when you focus on that, you get the problem of psychology. That's at least and you get the hard problem of consciousness. And you get an enormous amount of inconsistencies and a failure to build a natural philosophy of reliable, everyday, gross understandings of events like this conversation, rather than the, say, spiritual whatever event that allowed those worlds, however we make sense out of it, a reliable exploration of events that a scientific, conservative scientific methodology can identify across a particular kind of consensus, I'm arguing, is not available to us. That's what the Enlightenment gap is. It could be available if we make the right tweaks. Then all of a sudden it pops. It absolutely is not foundational, and at least certainly not the way I'm pursuing it. And it's not ontologically restrictive in saying this is all it is. It's epistemologically framed as endo-natural. So in other words, it's like, how is science knowing? And science is going to be constrained by all the reasons that you and Bobby say. It's like, well, if you label it this and then you create a circular explanation, that's a problem. All I'm saying is when we look into the consensus of conservative science, we have a bad model. That's what I'm saying. And the problem of psychology, the hard problem of consciousness, the way I frame the enlightenment gap is my justification that says the conservative model itself can't work. But Sean Carroll can't make it all work so that my psychology, in the most basic way of a neurocognitive structure that even has any kind of conscious experience like I'm experiencing now, nothing super, can't fit. So that's what the within and endo natural means. Then if you want to say it's not enough, then all I would say is, okay, your scientific worldview D, Sean called it exo, and he's into it. So I point in that direction. I'm not making, I really don't want to get into that. That's just not my, I've studied it and I just throw my hands up in terms of, I don't know how to make sense out of it. The combination of, so that's my response is that the within is a focus to go to Sean Carroll and all the other scientists, E.O. Wilson, all the big history people, everyone that's producing in naturalism, and for me to say, wake up to the fact that it's inadequate and incomplete. There is a fundamental enlightenment gap, and it doesn't have to be there. A scientific worldview saves us from that. Maybe maybe scientific worldview D is the ultimate way where place will end up. But I'll say that's my response in relationship to your lovely articulation.
Yeah, no, that all lands perfectly for me. And as you know, I not only love you, but I love your map of all of this. And it's a lot of information. Like I said, I got dizzy repeating it just yesterday and the day before. But yeah, so the exo-endo distinction might not have the baggage with it that I was teasing apart, maybe. But it's kind of, like I said, it seemed to me like a stealth version of the natural, supernatural thing. That there's something about it that says those other things that Rick thinks are real, they're not on the table of the data. They're exos somehow or another. And science is the theory that should solve everything that's on the table of the data. And it's like, well, no, this data belongs on the table too. But I understand the project that you're working on is great. It's so much better than anything that I think that's come before it. So, you've got my total support in that. I just think that it would be great for me if folks like you paid a little more attention to what Dean Radin says is on the table of the data that science should take into account. And if it's real, it's part of the natural world. So the language of natural and supernatural, like cat is only meaningful if there are non-cats. Natural is only meaningful if there's non-natural things. I'm not sure. But that's all I'll say back. I don't think in fact, when I was making a big deal out of exo and endo, I thought Greg might not really be responsible for this. It might be Sean. But I still wanted to address my criticism of that idea that scientific worldview D is somehow or another radically different. It is different insofar as, yes, you'll get more scientists to agree on A, B, or C than you will on D. But what is this, the majority vote that determines whether or not something is true? So, okay, that's all I have to say for now.